one really grand thing about the Alpro company is that they provided countless alternatives to like mainstream milk. So here we have obviously almond and soya, which in my opinion are probably like the most boring ones, but they're still alright. I mean, soya is cool because it's just standard, right? Of course, it's the thing you grew up with. As a kid, this was kind of trash to me. It tasted really weird and strange, but they've improved it like greatly, like to a massive appeal. Like it used to be like up here, and now it's definitely climbed. Almond milk is still hit and miss with me, but it's starting to grow on me. But if you really don't like these, there's cashew milk. There's rice. I think they've got coconut, which I'm not going to try. They've got everything, to be honest. Like they've got like so many things. My favorite is probably hazelnut because it has that nice kind of like flavor to it. But too many of my friends are allergic to nuts, so I can't even buy it for them. A bit frustrating, but you know what I mean. However, you know, with their ridiculously cheap prices and ability to get things like this size for like less than £16 or so, plus triple points if you're a member, it's almost like there is really no alternative to Papa John's. To be honest, like I haven't really found one that gives you that amount of pizza at that quality for that price, and also the points reward scheme just makes it worthwhile. I now have 50 points stacked up, which is literally two pizzas worth of points. So, you know, sometimes not having an alternative isn't a bad thing, but it'd be nice to see another pizza company that can actually compete with Papa John's. But who knows? See, the weird lighting thing's probably back from last time because I think more things need to be brought to light. When one speaks about, you know, oversaturation of one thing or just general like lack of another thing, you know, they seem to often, or at least the way it's read, it seems to often see as this thing like they see whatever is the dominant thing or the most common thing, see whether it be like males in STEM, for example, or I don't know, black people in hip hop, as the problem. Whereas I'm not sure how people feel, but a lot of time I've seen the problem or what people may be pointing to necessarily is the fact that there's no alternatives to that are seen as viable in the mainstream, for example. Like you still have to this day, like, oh, like, a white basketball player is still a bit of a deal, or female scientists, despite the fact that there have been numerous Nobel Prize winners, for example. And from thinking about this, I also thought about the weirdness of like alternatives, like not just inside like things like sports and culture and other culture, but also in like terms of like representation. So obviously a big deal, for example, we talk about representation in Hollywood, because Hollywood is like the preeminent movie industry of the world of sorts. It's English language, it's American, big money, big budget. Everyone wants to be in a Hollywood film, unless they want to be in a big film. To the point where like even countries like, Britain and France, despite having, enough money and enough of at least some form of cultural footprint on the world, generally pale in comparison to what they can put out, But when we talk about specific representation, it's not only enough to talk about things like, marginalized groups. Marginalized groups is also very important, obviously. Things like not telling the same old, three stories about, say, black people being either like from single parent homes or the struggle or slave, for example, or the same old like middle America cute white family that has this one or two little bits of drama which don't really divert from each other that much. The boyhood scenario of sorts, or representation of, say, like Asian families and culture as more than just the sum of a few stereotypes and maybe some cute ending towards the end. but also representation of issues or just showing diversity. So I think, for example, a really important one is uh, discussions about obviously mental things, discussions about things like autism, for example, you know, and the way people, maybe infer autism as what is just portrayed on the screen, because a lot of people don't take the time out to like understand, the spectrum, for example, and also remember, as we often are quite trapped, especially when we don't know people who are represented by these characters or by these stories that we keep encountering with, remembering the uniqueness of each person, for example. So that's the weird thing about, like, if you are in a community where you are closer to what is the like default, for example, so United Kingdom uh, being like of Anglo-Saxon origin, for example, Protestant Christian upbringing of some sort, even if you're not like religious, like at least you can get the references to the Bible, for example, because you might have sung a couple songs in school, for example. These things often it's easy to think of like someone like you as an individual, because both you're an individual, you probably know each other to a deeper level, but it's hard to, or at least harder to get over these little things, especially when I haven't really got a real grasp of what an individual in that situation is like and how these things can vary. For example, a big one is representation of alternative black people, especially those who are children of immigrants. So obviously they are often born, like me, for example, born in a country other than their parents. So they have inherited part of their parents' culture because, they were raised by them. But generally they're more engaged into like, alternative cultures that within whatever country they grew up in, like alternative. For example, I'm more into like alternative rock. For example, I'm not really into like the pop stuff or into like the popular stuff. I think it's best characterized by a guy in a club asking like, I didn't want to like jump to conclusions, but do you happen to be into rap music, for example? At least he was quite tasteful about asking about it, for example. But it shows the general consensus. I mean, I can enjoy grime, for example, but I even grew up in South London. I grew up in urban London. It's where grime was born. But, growing up, it was hard for me to even find people and find the pride to just be me, And that goes into the other thing about the awkwardness of being alternative is often the fact that it's in reaction or in relation to whatever the mainstream thing, whatever the default is. Like I said, went back to the whole thing about, the default pop sound that comes from, often whiter people who obviously have been raised by, maybe often traditional Protestant families, for example, the whole WASP thing. At least when you talk about UK and UK culture, UK music, art, for example, like visual art is quite a big one. We talk a lot about visual art and its actual diversity, for example. What was I going with? Also, but also like the fact that it often sees itself as alternative in relation to this, but maybe finds issues remembering to be itself. Now, obviously, I understand it's important to be reactionary, for example, which is where I was going to my next point about what's it, Captain Africa? No, what's his name? The Black Panther movie. Some people have called it diversity in itself, where even although in itself it's obviously focused very like black cast. I don't know how many actual Africans are in the Black Panther. I haven't really looked at the cast, but very black cast. So some people are saying, how can that be seen as diverse when 90% of them are the same race, at least? And it's funny, it's only seen as, even potentially seen as diverse because of in reaction and in relation to the general default, casting diversity of an average Hollywood movie. And especially when there's many, many movies where, there is literally a token black guy. It's in relation to these, when you do combine this this one movie with like 95+% black people and put it into Hollywood, then Hollywood looks more diverse overall, because you can say, oh, overall we've got, so last year we had 20 actors in some kind of notable role. Now, because of this movie, we have an extra 10, so we have 30 actors. That's an improvement of 10 actors. That's an improvement of 50%, in 1 year, which goes into other things. The whole Oscar so white debacle, and I always pointed out the fact that it's caused by the fact that it's hard to get big performances that produce, potentially award-winning productions if at the sheer grassroots level of like casting and stories and diversity of stories, there isn't a lot of diverse roles, for example. That's why we have this actually our idea of an Oscar movie, because the same kind of vibe, the same kind of trope of an Oscar movie. Like every year, there's already few films that basically just there because they're like the same type of actors and all these things, the same type of stories. Not too revolutionary, but powerful, well made. You can't hate on these movies, but that's often the problem, because people don't. Why, I don't know if enough people talk about the grassroots issue of how many people would like to do things but are stopped because of other issues outside. The thing is, how many casting calls, how many roles were even suitable for three-dimensional, non-white, non-male in some cases, or non-traditional character, for example. And even then, if there was a diversity of roles, how well funded are these other movies, for example, to actually get the big budget and make it as powerful as possible to appeal to this traditional Oscar audience, which are normally older people. For example, it's all these little gaps you have to get around. So the Academy has some responsibility, I guess, for things like Oscar so white, but it's more a knock-on effect of what I call the lack of, grassroots foundations for actors, regardless of whatever the background they have, And then there's the other question of where one looks to talk about the lack of alternatives, can one also look to say, what if we just try and prop all these other things up and ignore this mainstream idea completely? Instead of trying to change the mainstream idea or trying to really feed it, can we just make it straight, like completely ignore it? And be fully isolationist in a way. So this is strange, I guess, in terms of global things, because obviously, okay, I'll give an example. Me as a person, I can appreciate music from anywhere. I mean, I can sing along to Talipa Ruiz. I can re-listen to Al Harmonia, this amazing North African jazz band. Al Harmonia or the Shabi Jazz, yeah. But I can listen to Japanese stuff. We have the phenomenon of the weeb. People can appreciate stuff outside of their culture and actually connect to it in some ways more than stuff that's immediately around them, for example. And maybe if you just prop these things up, so it kind of competes in a more of an open sphere, perhaps. But then one cannot ignore the hegemony of whatever mainstream is within their society, which is probably something I'll go on to in the next video. But generally speaking, it's strange, and I think it's quite hard to deliberate, really, or quite hard for me to provide a necessary solution that works. But I really honestly think that if we just look to promote alternatives, and if people are able to open up, then naturally there will probably be a shift anyway, because it become the mainstream thing to find alternatives and say, oh, what if you compare this to this? Comparing, I can't even think of an example. I'm trying to think of a British example. Comparing Poppy Shakespeare, for example, and its representations of, mental illness, for example, and, the system, to other big budget films, and seeing making it more of a mainstream thing outside of the circle of, avid movie goers, for example. If we can seek maybe this kind of approach to other things, who knows, there might not be an alternative anymore. It will just be one alternative. There won't be the alternative. It will just be one of many alternatives. Maybe we'll have more of a anarchic structure, of course. But perhaps this hegemony is a reflection of, our society, and how anarchy doesn't really exist in many cultures outside of, smaller groups, perhaps. So, maybe this is all a knockdown effect, perhaps.